Wind screamed across bare ridges snow-dusted Main Street, carrying ice needles that stung Clara Hayes' cheeks as she pushed open a heavy door of the staggering Bowl Saloon. Inside, the fog of tobacco smoke, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies hit her like a physical blow. She clutched the creased letter, her letter, Amos Tate's proposal, like a shield against a sudden, heavy silence. Every eye, from the grizzled miners at the bar to the painted women by the piano, fixed on her travel-worn dress and hopeful, terrified eyes. Amos Tate, broad-shouldered and smug beside the roaring stone hearth, didn't rise. A cruel smirk split his face. "Well, look what the blizzard blew in," he drawled, his voice silencing the last murmur. "Miss Hayes, that letter weren't no proposal. Just a wager, darling. $10, says the desperate fool'd actually come." Roaring laughter erupted, crushing Clara's world. Then, from the shadowed corner, a figure cloaked in stillness stood. Silence fell again, sharp as broken glass. Who dared challenge the town's cruelest power? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The laughter followed Clara out into the knife-edge wind, a physical force that shoved her back against the saloon's rough-hewn wall. Shame burned hotter than the whiskey fumes inside, warring with the biting cold that already numbed her fingers through thin gloves. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the echoing mockery. A wager, $10. Her grip on the letter tightened until the paper threatened to tear. The ink promises bled into meaningless smudges against her palm. She'd sold her mother's locket for this journey, endured days crammed in a freezing stagecoach, fueled by the fragile hope offered by Amos Tate's eloquent words. Words now revealed as a rancher's cruel joke. A heavy presence materialized beside her, not touching, but a solid wall against the gale. She flinched, expecting another blow, verbal or otherwise. Through the blur of unshed tears, she saw the man from shadows. He was tall, lean as a winter-starved wolf, wrapped in a long, dark coat worn smooth at the elbows and cuffs. A battered, wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, but she caught the stark line of a clean-shaven jaw. Tight would contain anger or perhaps just enduring bleakness. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, were a startling pale gray, like river ice over deep water, holding no mockery, only a profound, weary stillness. He didn't speak. He simply gestured sharply with his head toward the livery stable across the rutted, frozen street, then stepped off the boardwalk into the deepening twilight, his stride long and purposeful, expecting her to follow. Clara hesitated, the instinct to flee warring with the terrifying prospect of being utterly alone in this hostile, frozen place. Behind her, the saloon door burst open again, spilling light and raucous sound. Amos Tate's voice boomed out, thick with malice and liquor. "Where you going, ghost? Found yourself astray? Careful, she might be disease." More laughter, uglier this time. The man ghost didn't turn. He kept walking, his shoulders set against the taunts like granite against the wind. The utter dismissal in his posture was more powerful than any retort. Taking a shuddering breath that scraped her raw throat, Clara pushed away from the wall and stumbled after him, the packed snow crunching treacherously underfoot. He led her not to the main livery, but around back to a smaller, dilapidated lean-to sheltering a single stall. A sturdy, unassuming bay mare stamped her feet within, breath pluming in the cold air. Without a word, the man began efficiently saddling the horse, his movements economical, practiced. Clara stood shivering, clutching her small, worn carpet bag, feeling the curious stares of townsfolk hurrying home before full dark. Whispers carried on the wind. "That's Holt, the Iron Ghost. What's he want with her?" Tate's gonna be riled. The moniker sent a fresh chill through her. Iron Ghost. It spoke of isolation, perhaps danger. Yet, facing the prospect of freezing in the street or being dragged back into the saloon's mockery, this spectral figure felt like her only lifeline. He finished cinching the saddle and turned, holding the mare's reins loosely. "Can you ride?" His voice was low, gravelly as if unused. It wasn't unkind, merely direct. Clara nodded, finding her own voice thin and brittle. "Yes, enough." He gave a curt nod, then swung himself up into the saddle with fluid ease. He extended a gloved hand down to her. She hesitated only a heartbeat. The memory of Amos Tate's sneer sharp in her mind, then placed her chill fingers in his. His grip was strong, calloused, and he lifted her effortlessly onto the horse behind him. There was no room for propriety. She had to slide her arms around his waist to steady herself as the mare shifted. He felt solid, unyielding as oak beneath the worn wool of his coat, radiating a surprising warmth. He didn't react to her touch, simply nudged the horse forward with a soft click of his tongue. They left Bear Ridge behind, the feeble yellow squares of its windows shrinking into the vast, encroaching indigo of the prairie twilight. The wind, unbroken now by buildings, howled across the open expanse, scouring the snow into swirling eddies and cutting through Clara's inadequate clothing like knives. She pressed closer to the man's back, seeking what little shelter she could, burying her face against the rough fabric. The rhythmic plod of the mare's hooves on the frozen trail, the creak of leather, and the endless wail of the wind were the only sounds. Shame still coiled hot in her belly, but was slowly being overtaken by a bone-deep exhaustion and a gnawing dread of where this silent man was taking her. They rode for what felt like hours, though the moon, veiled by scudding clouds, had barely risen above the jagged silhouette of the distant Medicine Bow Range. The landscape grew wilder, the trail less distinct, winding through skeletal stands of lodgepole pine that clawed at the bruised sky. Snow lay thicker here, drifted against the dark trunks. The cold seeped deeper, a tangible presence. Clara's teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. Just as she felt she might slide from the horse into the oblivion of the snow, the man reined in. Ahead, nestled against a steep, rocky outcrop that offered some shelter from the prevailing wind, stood a cabin. It was small, built of logs darkened by weather and time, the chinking between them looking ancient. A thin wisp of smoke struggled from a stone chimney, immediately snatched away by the gale. A single small window, covered by an oiled hide from the inside, glowed faintly with the promise of firelight. It looked less like a home and more like a fortification against the world. He dismounted stiffly, then helped her down, her legs nearly buckled, numb with cold and fatigue. He secured the mare to a hitching post near a small, covered lean-to that held a meager stack of firewood, then gestured wordlessly toward the cabin door. Clara stumbled forward, pushing it open. The warmth inside was a physical shock, almost painful. The single room was Spartan, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled. The air smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, coffee grounds, and something else, a deep, lingering scent of solitude. A rough-hewn table and single chair stood near the fire, a narrow cot against the far wall covered with a faded quilt. Shelves held basic supplies, tins, sacks of flour and beans, a few worn books. A Winchester rifle leaned in one corner near the door. A Colt revolver hung in its holster from a peg beside it. A single kerosene lantern on the table provided a pool of wavering light. It was clean, orderly, and utterly devoid of comfort or personal touch, save for a worn, brass-cased pocket watch resting on the mantelpiece above the fire, its glass face reflecting the flames. The man, Gideon Holt, she presumed, the name ghost settling uneasily in her mind, followed her in, shutting the door firmly against the storm. He moved the fire, adding a split log with practiced ease, the flames leaping hungrily. He shrugged out of his heavy coat, hanging it on a peg, revealing a faded blue wool shirt tucked into dark trousers. He was thinner than he'd seemed bundled up, the lines of his face sharper in the firelight. Those pale eyes regarded her, unreadable. "Sit." He gestured towards a chair. He busied himself filling a blackened tin coffee pot from a bucket of water near the door and setting it on the iron hook swung over the fire. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and shared humiliation. Clara sank into the chair. It was hard and cold even through her skirts. She kept her carpet bag clutched on her lap, a pathetic shield. He turned, leaning against the rough stone of the fireplace mantel, his gaze resting not on her, but on the pocket watch. The firelight caught the deep scratches on its casing, the faint etching of an eagle barely visible. His thumb brushed over it, a gesture so fleeting and unconscious Clara almost missed it. But the shadow that crossed his face was unmistakable, a bleakness that went beyond the cold outside. It was the look of a man haunted. Why? The word escaped Clara before she could stop it, her voice raw. Why did you interfere? He didn't look up from the watch immediately. When he finally met her eyes, the gray depths held a weariness that seemed ancient. Tate's a bully, likes kicking folks when they're down. His voice was flat. Didn't need that spectacle. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, no one deserves that. His gaze flickered over her worn dress, her shivering form. What brought you here? Truly. Clara looked down at her hands, knuckles white on the bag. Shame warred with a desperate need to explain, to not be seen as merely the punchline of Tate's joke. My father, he was a banker. Back east. There was the scandal, embezzlement. He took his own life. The words came out in a brittle rush. The shame, it followed us. My mother died soon after. There was nothing left, no prospects. The letter, Mr. Tate's letter, it seemed like salvation, a chance to start over, far away. She risked a glance up. I didn't know it was a lie. Gideon absorbed this, his expression unchanging. Yet she sensed a subtle shift, a recognition of a different kind of exile. He stirred the coffee pot with a battered spoon. Salvation's in short supply out here, Miss Hayes. Mostly just survival. Clara, she whispered. Please. He nodded once. Gideon Holt. The coffee began to bubble, filling the small space with its rich, bitter aroma. He poured 2 tin mugs full, black and steaming. He handed one to her. Her frozen fingers curled gratefully around the hot metal. The warmth seeped into her bones, a small, tangible comfort. He didn't take the chair, remaining standing by the fire, sipping his own coffee, staring into the flames. The pocket watch gleamed dully beside him. And you? Clara ventured softly, emboldened by the warmth and the quiet. Why do they call you the Iron Ghost? She regretted the question instantly as his shoulders tensed, a minute but definite reaction. His gaze remained fixed on the fire, but she saw his jaw clench. A long silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the logs and the relentless moan of the wind outside. When he spoke, his voice was low, stripped bare. War. The single word held galaxies of pain. Commanded men. Made a call. Wrong call. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. Good men died. My fault. His hand closed into a fist at his side, then slowly relaxed. The army, they needed a scapegoat. Dishonorable discharge. The name, Iron Ghost, started then. Meant I was already dead to them. Just didn't stop breathing. He finally looked away from the fire, his gaze distant. Seeing horrors Clara couldn't imagine. Came out here. Stayed. Easier that way. Less damage to do. The raw confession hung heavy in the air. Clara understood then the profound isolation etched into every line of him. His exile wasn't just physical. It was a prison of guilt and regret. He hadn't brought her here out of kindness, she realized, but perhaps out of grim recognition of another soul cast adrift, another life irrevocably altered by forces beyond control. They were 2 ghosts, haunting the same desolate edge of the world. He pushed off from the mantle, the moment of vulnerability, snapping shut like a trap. You can have the cot tonight, he stated, his voice regaining its flat neutrality. I'll take the floor by the fire. He moved toward the trunk near the cot, pulling out a thick, gray wool blanket. He tossed it toward her. It landed heavily on her lap, smelling faintly of lye soap and pine. Storm set in. You won't be going anywhere before dawn. Clara clutched the blanket, its rough texture real beneath her fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Holt." Gideon. The name felt strange on her tongue. He merely grunted, busying himself with arranging his own bedding, a bedroll and a saddle blanket near the hearth. The fragile thread of connection, spun from shared shame and painful revelation, seemed to fray in the face of practicalities and ingrained solitude. The howl of the wind was a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness pressing in on the small circle of firelight. Clara sipped her coffee, the bitter brew warming her from the inside. Exhaustion pulled at her, a leaden weight. The events of the day, the journey's hope, the shattering humiliation, the terrifying escape, the stark reality of this refuge, crashed over her in waves. She stared into flames, seeing not the dancing light, but Amos Tate's cruel smirk, the laughing faces in the saloon, the desolate expanse of snow, and Gideon Holt's haunted eyes. He banked the fire, the room dimming as the flames sank lower. He stretched out on his makeshift bedroll, his back to her a dark, silent mound. Clara rose stiffly and moved to the cot. It was hard, the straw mattress thin, but it was shelter. She pulled the scratchy blanket over herself. Still fully dressed, listening to the wind shriek around the cabin corners and the slow, steady rhythm of Gideon's breathing. The pocket watch on the mantel caught a stray ember's glow, its scratched brass face a silent witness to the ghost sharing this lonely space. Just as the edges of sleep began to blur the harsh reality, muffled by the storm's fury but unmistakable in the sudden, watchful stillness that fell over Gideon's prone form. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks hammered against the heavy cabin door. The 3 knocks, sharp as pistol shots against the thick oak door, froze the air inside the cabin tighter than the ice forming on the window hide. Gideon Holt moved with the lethal grace of a predator startled from sleep. One moment he was a dark mound on the floor. The next he was upright, the Colt revolver materializing in his hand, as if drawn by the sound itself. The firelight caught the cold blue steel. He didn't look at Clara, his entire focus riveted on the door, his body angled slightly, presenting a narrower target. His breath, a moment ago the slow rhythm of sleep, was now shallow and silent. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sat bolt upright on the cot, the scratchy blanket clutched to her chin, every nerve screaming. Amos. It had to be Amos Tate, come to drag her back to Bear Ridge, or worse. The image of his sneering face, the raucous laughter of the saloon, flooded back, chilling her more deeply than the storm outside. The fragile warmth and tentative safety of the cabin evaporated. Gideon held up a hand, palm flat toward her, a clear, silent command. Stay. Be silent. He moved like smoke, sidling towards a small, hide-covered window beside the door. With infinite care, using only the tips of his gloved fingers, he eased a corner of the stiffened hide back, just enough to peer out into the howling darkness. Wind-driven snow swirled violently in the narrow slice of night visible. The feeble glow from the bank fire cast long, dancing shadows across the tense planes of his face. He scanned left, then right, his pale eyes narrowed to slits. A tense minute stretched, thin as ice over a creek in spring. Clara could hear her own blood pounding in her ears, louder than the wind's mournful cry. Gideon remained utterly still, a statue carved from vigilance. Then a subtle shift. His shoulders held rigid, eased almost imperceptibly. The tension didn't leave his frame, but the immediate, coiled spring readiness softened. He lowered the Colt slightly, though he didn't holster it. He let the hide covering fall back into place. Not Tate, he murmured, his voice low and gravelly, barely audible above the storm's fury. He moved to the door, but didn't open it. Instead, he pressed his ear against the weathered wood, listening intently. After another long moment, he slid the heavy iron bolt back with a soft, grating sound and cracked the door open just wide enough to peer out, his body still braced offensively behind it. Clara strained to see, catching only a glimpse of swirling white in the dark, bulky shape of a man hunched against the elements on the small porch. Snow dusted a worn, shapeless hat, and a thick muffler wrapped high around the face. Holt. The voice was muffled by the wind and the scarf, rough but not overtly threatening. "That you? Heard tell you might have company." Gideon's response was curt. "What do you want, Silas?" Silas. The name meant nothing to Clara, but Gideon's tone held recognition, laced with wariness rather than outright hostility. "Just passing through this godforsaken weather." The man called Silas replied, shifting his weight. "Saw the smoke. Figured I'd warn ya. Tate's boys are out. 3 of 'em. Rode out of Bear Ridge about an hour for the worst hit. Looking mighty purposeful, heading this general direction." He paused, and Clara imagined him peering past Gideon, trying to catch a glimpse inside. Rumors flying faster than the snow about the girl Tate humiliated and who took her off. Gideon remained silent for a beat. "Appreciate the warning, Silas, but you best move on. Storm's deepening." "Aye, that it is," Silas agreed, a note of resignation in his voice. "Watch your back, Ghost. Tate ain't one to let a challenge slide, especially not from well." He didn't finish. The bulky shape turned, vanishing into the white maelstrom as quickly as it had appeared. Gideon shut the door firmly, throwing the bolt home with a heavy, final thud. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet of the cabin, the storm's voice momentarily muffled. He holstered the Colt, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at Clara immediately, instead walking back to the fireplace. He picked up the iron poker and stirred the embers, coaxing a reluctant flame back to life. The orange light flickered over his profile, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of solitude and regret. The pocket watch on the mantel gleamed dully. "Silas Rourke," Gideon said, his back still to her. "Trapper. Mostly harmless. Drifts through." He added another split log to the fire. Sparks flew upwards like tiny, fleeing stars. But he's right. Tate's men are coming. The confirmation sent a fresh wave of fear through Clara. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was pursuit. She swung her legs off the cot, the rough-hewn floorboards cold even through her stockings. What will they do? Gideon turned, his gray eyes meeting hers. They held no panic, only a weary calculation. Depends on Tate's orders. Scare, intimidate, maybe try to take you back. Maybe just make a point to me. He glanced towards a Winchester leaning in the corner. Point being, he owns Bear Ridge, and anyone deaf him pays. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the borrowed blanket slipping from her shoulders. The warmth of the fire couldn't penetrate the sudden chill inside her. "I'm sorry. I brought this trouble to your door." A flicker of something almost like surprise crossed his face, quickly masked. "Trouble finds its own way out here, Miss Hayes. Tate's been looking for an excuse to rattle my cage for a while. My land backs onto the best grazing in the upper valley. He covets it." He gestured vaguely westward. "Calls my holding wasted on a hermit. Figures I'll crack, sell cheap, or just disappear." His voice was flat, but Clara heard the underlying steel. This exile wasn't just about guilt. It was a stand against a different kind of predator. He moved to the table, picking up the tin coffee pot. It was cold now. He set it back on the hook over the renewed flames. The mundane act, in the face of looming danger, felt strangely grounding. Clara stood, letting the blanket fall fully. She couldn't just sit and wait for the storm to bring violence. "Can I help?" Her voice was small but steady. Gideon paused, looking at her. His gaze swept over her thin dress, her travel-worn boots, then settled on her face. He saw the fear, yes, but also a stubborn resolve he hadn't noticed before, a spark that hadn't been entirely extinguished by Tate's cruelty. "Water buckets near empty," he said finally, nodding towards a large wooden pail by the door. "Barrels outside, around the east corner. Covered, but the spout might be froze. Hatchets there if you need to break ice. Wrap up." He gestured to his spare coat hanging on a peg, a thick, worn buffalo hide garment that looked enormous. It wasn't a grand task, but it was something, an offering of usefulness. Clara nodded, moving quickly. She pulled on her own inadequate coat over her dress, then wrestled Gideon's heavy buffalo coat over that. It swallowed her, the sleeves falling past her fingertips, the weight immense but comforting. The smell of wood smoke, horse, and old leather enveloped her. She pulled on her thin gloves, took the empty pail, and, steeling herself, unbolted the door. The wind hit her like a physical wall, stealing her breath. Snow stung her exposed cheeks and eyes. The world beyond the porch was a chaotic blur of white and gray, the skeletal pines whipping violently in the gale. She could barely see the outline of the water barrel tucked against the cabin's east wall. Gripping the pail handle tightly, she plunged into the maelstrom, the door closing firmly behind her. The short distance felt like miles. Snow clawed at her legs, sucked at her boots. The wind screamed at her ears, a banshee wail that drowned all other sound. She reached the barrel. Its wooden staves rhymed thick with ice. The metal spout was indeed frozen solid, a glistening plug. Remembering the hatchet Gideon mentioned, she spotted it buried handle deep in a nearby chopping block already half buried by drift. Wrestling it free took effort, her hands clumsy in the cold even through the gloves. She raised the hatchet, bringing it down sharply on the ice clogging the spout. The impact jarred her arms. She struck again and again, chips of ice flying. Finally, with a crack, the plug gave way. Icy water, shockingly cold, began to trickle out. She held the pail beneath it, shivering violently now, the buffalo coat the only thing between her and hypothermia. As she waited for the pail to fill, her gaze swept the swirling whiteness. Scanning the tree line barely visible 30 yards away, were Tate's men out there now, watching? The thought made her skin crawl. She thought of her mother after the scandal broke. The way society's doors had slammed shut, the whispers like poison, the slow erosion of hope until illness claimed her, a broken woman whispering apologies Clara didn't understand until later. Outcast. The word resonated bitterly. She'd fled east, only to find a different, crueler kind of casting out here in the west. Was there no place for the stained? The pail was heavy when full. She wrestled the hatchet back into the block, then lifted the sloshing burden. Turning back towards the cabin door, a movement caught her eye. Not in the trees, but lower, near the base of the porch steps. Partially buried by the drifting snow, something gleamed dully. Not ice, metal. She took a step closer, squinting against the stinging snow. It was a spur, a single, ornate rowel spur, silver inlay visible even under the snow, attached to a torn leather strap. It hadn't been there when they arrived. Someone had been here recently, right at their threshold. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She grabbed the spur, stuffing it deep into the pocket of Gideon's coat, then hefted the water pail and stumbled back to the door, pounding on it with her free hand. Gideon opened immediately, his expression grim as he took in her snow-caked state and wide eyes. He pulled her inside, bolted the door, and took the heavy pail from her numb hands. Spur, Clara gasped, pulling the cold metal object from the pocket and holding it out. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. By the steps buried, but new. Gideon took the spur, his face hardening. He turned it over in his gloved hand, his thumb rubbing over the intricate silver design, a stylized T intertwined with a rope. Recognition flashed in his icy eyes, followed by cold fury. Tate's brand. His foreman, Rourke, not the trapper, another one, big fella, wears a match set like this. He tossed the spur onto the table with a clatter. Scouting, marking the place. Silas was right. They're close. He moved swiftly to the window, peering out again, his body radiating tension. Clara shed the heavy buffalo coat, her limbs trembling with cold and adrenaline. She moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out to the blaze, trying to stop the shivering. The shared task, the discovery of the spur, it felt like they were standing back to back against a storm, both literal and human. Gideon turned from the window, his expression unreadable. They won't try anything in this blow. Too risky. They'll wait for it to ease, or for dawn. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, huddled by the fire. You did good, spotting that. It was grudging praise, but genuine. The simple words warmed her more than the fire. She managed a shaky nod. He busied himself checking the Winchester. The metallic clicks loud in the cabin. The pocket watch on the mantel seemed to tick louder now, a counterpoint to Storm's howl and the looming threat. Gideon paused, his hand hovering near the watch. He didn't pick it up, but his gaze lingered on its scratched face. "Fort Mercer," he said abruptly, the words seeming ripped from him by the tension in the air. He didn't look at Clara, his eyes fixed on the watch as if seeing something else entirely. Arizona territory. 82, we were pinned down. Ambush. Apache. Good ground, but too many. His voice was low, stripped of inflection, yet each word carried the weight of granite. My command. Sergeant Jenkins, young kid, eager. Saw a gap, a chance to flank M. I gave the order. He swallowed, a hard knot moving in his throat. Wasn't a gap, was a trap. Jenkins, 5 others. Cut down before they made 20 yards. His hand finally closed around the watch, his knuckles white. This was Jenkins. Took it off him after. Told his ma I'd bring it back. Never did. Couldn't face her. He looked up then, his gray eyes meeting Clara's, filled with a desolation as vast as the Wyoming prairie. The ghost wasn't just the Army's name. It's what I am, haunting the places where the living don't belong. The raw pain in his confession hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Clara understood the watch wasn't just guilt. It was an unfulfilled promise, a life debt he felt he could never repay. His exile was a self-imposed sentence for a moment's tragic error. She thought her father's final, desperate act, the shame he couldn't outrun. Different circumstances, same crushing way of consequence. He trusted you, Clara said softly, the firelight reflecting in her own eyes. Jenkins, he followed your order. To his death, Gideon rasped. But you carry it, she persisted, a strange courage rising in her. His watch, the weight, you haven't forgotten. Isn't that something? Against a ghost? He stared at her, a complex mix of surprise, pain, and something else, a flicker of something long buried, crossing his face. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to retreat back into his shell. Before he could speak, a new sound sliced through the storm's constant roar. Not wind, not the creak of timber. Hoofbeats, distinct, purposeful, and terrifyingly close, crunching to the frozen snow directly toward the cabin. The crunch of hoofbeats, sharp and deliberate against the frozen earth beneath the snow's muffling blanket, ceased abruptly just beyond the cabin's thin walls. Silence followed, thick and suffocating, broken only by the wind's relentless shriek and the frantic hammering of Clara's heart against her ribs. Gideon Holt moved with the lethal economy of a man long accustomed to sudden violence. He was already at the window, the hide covering pulled back just enough, the barrel of the Winchester resting steady on the sill. His face, etched in the firelight's stark relief, was granite, cold, hard, utterly focused. He didn't speak, merely tilted his head fractionally towards a heavy timber door, his pale eyes commanding Clara to stay back, stay low. Clara pressed herself flat against the rough log wall beside the fireplace, the stone's residual warmth doing nothing to dispel the ice flooding her veins. The borrowed buffalo coat felt like a lead weight. She could hear the muffled voices now, rough and impatient, carried on gusts of wind. 2, maybe 3 men. The scrape of boots on the porch planks, snow-laden and protesting. A heavy fist pounded on the door, harder than Silas Rourke's knocks, rattling the iron bolt in its bracket. Holt, open up. Amos Tate wants a word. The voice was a gravelly bark, familiar only in its arrogance. Rourke, the foreman whose spur she'd found. Gideon's response was low, pitched to carry through the wood. Tate ain't here. You're trespassing. Ride on. A harsh laugh answered him. Trespassing? On whose say-so, ghost? This land's up for grabs, and Amos aims to grab it. Hand over the girl. Tate's got a mind to discuss the terms of her departure from Bear Ridge. The implication hung foul in the air. She's under my roof, Gideon stated, his voice devoid of inflection, but carrying an undeniable finality. That makes her my concern. You got nothing to discuss with her. Your roof. Another voice, higher, sneering. This shack? Looks like a stiff breeze will take it. Open the damn door, Holt. For we open it for you, Amos won't take kindly to you harboring his property. Property. The word ignited a spark of fury beneath Clara's fear. She wasn't chattel, not anymore. Her hand tightened on the cold iron of the fireplace poker lying near her foot. It was heavy, clumsy, but it was something. Gideon's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the Winchester's trigger. Last chance. Ride out. Now. The answer was a thunderous crash against the door, the sound of a heavy shoulder ramming the solid oak. The bolt held, but the timbers groaned. Another crash followed. They weren't waiting. Gideon didn't hesitate. He shifted the Winchester's muzzle fractionally and fired. The report was deafening in confined space, a lance of flame and smoke erupting from the barrel. A cry of pain and surprise split the air outside, followed by curses and scrambling sounds. He's shot. The bastard shot Jed. Rourke's voice roared. Get the damn door down, the higher voice shrieked. Another heavy thud shook the door. Gideon worked the Winchester's lever, the spent cartridge clattering to the floor. He fired again, this time to the door itself, aiming low. A howl of agony answered, followed by panicked shouts and the sound of bodies stumbling back off the porch. Back! Get back! He's crazy! The higher voice was shrill with fear. Clara heard the frantic scrambling, the labored breathing of the wounded man, the curses fading as they retreated from the immediate porch. Hoofbeats sounded again, frantic this time, moving away into the swirling white chaos. The brief, brutal encounter was over as suddenly as it began. The silence that rushed back and felt heavier, charged with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fear. Gideon remained at the window, scanning the storm-blurred tree line, the Winchester still ready. His breathing was slow, controlled, but a fine tremor ran through the hand gripping the rifle stock. Clara pushed herself away from the wall, her legs trembling. She saw the spent brass cartridge gleaming dully on the floorboards near his boot. Are they gone? Her voice was a threadbare whisper. For now! Gideon rasped, finally lowering the rifle but not turning. Took 2 hits. One likely leg, maybe gut. They'll hole up somewhere out of the wind. 10 they're wounded, but they'll be back. Or Tate will send more. He turned then, his face grim. In the firelight, she saw a thin, dark line snaking down his left temple just above the ear. A splinter, kicked back from one of the shots fired through the door, had grazed him. Blood welled sluggishly, stark against his weathered skin. You're hurt, Clara gasped, stepping forward instinctively. Gideon touched his temple, his fingers coming away smeared with red. He dismissed it with a grunt. Scratch. But Clara was already moving. She remembered her mother, after the scandal, tending her father's increasingly erratic wounds, the cuts from broken glass when he lashed out in despair, the bruises from stumbling falls fueled by cheap gin. She'd learned to bind, to clean, to offer quiet comfort in the face of brokenness. She snatched a relatively clean scrap of linen from a pile near the wash basin, likely meant for gun cleaning, and dipped in the water pail she'd filled earlier. The water was icy, but would do. Sit, she said, her voice firmer now. Echoing a command from earlier, she pointed to the chair by the fire. For a heartbeat, Gideon looked like he might refuse, might retreat into his solitary stoicism. But he saw the determination in her eyes, the practical urgency that overrode his ingrained resistance. He sank into the chair with a barely audible sigh, the tension draining from his shoulders, replaced by a profound weariness. Clara approached cautiously. He was so still, like a statue carved from the wilderness itself. She dabbed gently at the cut. It was shallow but long, oozing steadily. He flinched minutely at the cold touch but didn't pull away. The intimacy of the act, Tending this hardened man's wound in the firelit cabin after the violence felt immense. She could smell the gunpowder, the leather of his vest, the underlying scent of pine and coal that clung to him. "My mother," Clara said softly, her focus on linen, the blood, needing to fill the silence charged with shared peril. After father, after everything, she never stopped trying to mend things. Broken plates, torn curtains. Him. Her voice hitched slightly. She'd hum while she worked, these sad little tunes, like she was stitching the world back together one thread at a time. Even when the neighbors wouldn't look at her, even when the whispers followed us like stray dogs, she kept stitching. She pressed the linen firmly for a moment to staunch the flow. She died stitching, mending one of my old dresses, trying to make it presentable for her. Well, it didn't matter. She just slipped away, like a thread snapping. Gideon was silent, his head bowed slightly under her ministrations. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows. The pocket watch on the mantel seemed to watch them. Jenkins, Gideon said, the name rough in his throat. He didn't look up. Had a harmonica. Terrible player. Sounded like a stepped-on cat. But he'd play it every night, out there under those Arizona stars. Drove the other men half mad. A ghost of something, not quite a smile, but a softening, touched his lips, gone as quickly as it came. He was trying to learn Lorena for a girl back home in Kansas. Never got past the first few notes without mangling it. He paused, the memory vivid and painful. That day at Fort Mercer, the harmonica was in his pocket. Bullet went right through it. Found it later, all bent metal and blood. His hand clenched on his knee. His ma, she asked about that harmonica in her last letter. Wanted to know if he'd played it much. The raw, unspoken grief hung between them, mingling with Clara's own memories of loss. Her mother's quiet mending, Jenkins's mangled music. Both futile attempts to hold on to beauty in a broken world. Clara finished cleaning the cut, finding a strip of clean rag to bind it snugly around his head. Her fingers brushed the coarse texture of his hair. He remained perfectly still. She'd have known he carried it, Clara said softly, tying off the bandage. That he tried. That's the mending, isn't it? Remembering the trying? Gideon lifted his head slowly. His gray eyes, usually as distant as winter stars, met hers. They held a profound exhaustion, a flicker of the pain he carried, and something else, a dawning, almost reluctant recognition. In her quiet strength, her refusal to be crushed, her understanding of carrying burdens. He saw an echo of something he'd thought lost. He didn't answer a question, but the harsh lines around his eyes softened infinitesimally. He reached up, his callous fingers brushing lightly over the bandage she'd tied. "Thank you, Clara." The simple use of her name, spoken without the formality of Miss Hayes, felt like a fragile bridge built between their isolated shores. He stood, the moment passing as quickly as it had come, the mantle of the soldier settling back over him. "They'll be back," he repeated, his voice regaining its practical edge. "We need to be ready. That scratch won't slow them long. Tate won't let this stand." He moved to the table, unrolling a worn piece of oilcloth that held his spare cartridges for the Winchester and Colt. He began methodically reloading, the metallic clicks a counterpoint to the storm. Clara watched him, the shared vulnerability replaced by the immediate, chilling reality. The brief connection, forged in blood and memory, was now a shared purpose. Survival. "What can I do?" Clara asked, her voice steady now. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was overlaid with a fierce determination. She wouldn't be taken back to Bear Ridge. She wouldn't let Tate win. And she wouldn't let this man, this haunted soul who'd offered her shelter, face this alone. Gideon glanced at her, assessing. Check the window hides. Make sure they're tight. No gaps. Then see if there's any pitch left in that small tin near the woodpile. We might need it for torches if they try after dark. He paused and added, "Keep the poker handy." Clara nodded, Moving to the window beside the door, she carefully checked the rawhide cord securing the stiffened buffalo hide over the opening. Pulling them tighter where they'd loosened, she found a small tin of pine pitch, its pungent smell sharp in the air. As she turned back toward the fire, something near the base of the woodpile caught her eye. A small, folded piece of oil paper, partially tucked under a log, almost invisible. It hadn't been there before the confrontation. Her breath caught. Had one of Tate's men slipped it inside during the chaos? While Gideon was distracted at the window, she snatched it up, her fingers trembling. Unfolding it quickly, she saw crude charcoal scratches on the inside. Not words, but a map, a rough outline of Gideon's cabin, the clearing, the trail leading back towards Bear Ridge. And on the trail, drawn with heavy, deliberate lines, were 3 distinct X marks. "Gideon," she breathed, holding out the paper. "Look." He took it, his eyes scanning the crude drawing. His face darkened. "Ambush points," he growled. They weren't just scouting. They were planning, marking where to hit us when we try to leave or when reinforcements come. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Tate's not just after you, Clara. Or the land. He wants me gone. Permanently." This is a declaration. The threat had just escalated exponentially. They weren't merely defending a cabin. They were surrounded, marked for elimination. The fragile warmth of the fire suddenly felt like a target. Gideon moved to the window again, scanning the storm with renewed intensity, the map's implication hardening his resolve. Hours crawled by. The storm showed no sign of relenting, the wind screaming its fury against the cabin. They took turns watching the windows, the tension a living thing coiling in the small space. Clara huddled near the fire, the poker across her lap, replaying the map's ominous marks in her mind. Gideon paced restlessly, a caged panther, the bandage a stark white slash against his temple. He stopped periodically to listen, his head cocked, straining to hear beyond the wind's wail. Near dusk, as the light bled from the sky into a deeper, snow-choked gray, Gideon froze mid-stride. He held up a hand, silencing Clara's unspoken question. His entire body was rigid, listening. Then Clara heard it too. Not hoofbeats this time. A different sound, weaving through the wind's howl. A voice, faint and strained, calling out. Not aggressive, pleading. "Holt! Gideon Holt! For pity's sake." It was Silas Rourke, the trapper, but his voice was ragged, laced with pain. Gideon was at the door in 2 strides, peering through the gap in the window hide. Clara joined him cautiously. Out in the swirling gloom, barely visible, was Silas. He wasn't on horseback. He was staggering through the deep snow toward the cabin, one arm clutched tightly to his side, dark staining the front of his heavy coat. Behind him, the trail he'd made was a ragged, crimson smear against the white. "He's hurt." Clara gasped. Gideon's expression was grim, calculating. Or it's a trap. Tate could be using him as bait. He watched as Silas stumbled, falling to his knees in the snow not 20 yards from the porch. The man looked up towards the cabin, his face pale and contorted. "Holt, they turned on me. Tate's gone mad. He's gathering every hard case from miles around. Says he's burning you out at first light. You gotta run." Silas coughed violently, a spray of red spotting the snow before him. The trapper's words hung in the frozen air, a dire prophecy. Burning them out, a mob gathered. Silas's blood staining the snow was a grim testament to Tate's ruthlessness, even towards those who might have aided him. Gideon's jaw tightened. Trust warred with survival instinct. Silas tried to push himself up, failed, collapsing face down into the snowdrift. He didn't move. Gideon's hand tightened on the Winchester. The firelight flickered, casting long, leaping shadows across the cabin walls, illuminating the brass pocket watch on the mantel. For a fleeting second, the scratched face seemed to catch the light like a signal flare. "Stay here," Gideon ordered, his voice like ice cracking. "Cover me." He unbolted the door. The command, "Cover me," hung in the frigid air, stark and final. Gideon Holt didn't wait for acknowledgement. He wrenched a heavy oak door open just wide enough to slip through, the storm's icy breath instantly swallowing him, leaving Clara alone with the frantic pounding of her heart and the poker's cold weight in her hands. She moved instantly to the window beside the door, easing the stiff hide covering the side just enough to peer out, the wind-driven snow stinging her eyes. Gideon was already a dark, crouching silhouette against the swirling white, moving with lethal grace towards the slumped form of Silas Rourke, the Winchester held low and ready. Every shadow in the churning gloom seemed to ride with potential menace. Clara scanned the tree line, the skeletal pines whipping violently, their branches like grasping claws. Was Rourke the lure? Were Tate's men, the wounded Jed, the sneering voice, the foreman Rourke with his missing spur, waiting in the drifts, rifles leveled? Her knuckles whitened on the poker. She remembered her mother, years ago, facing down the bank manager who'd come to evict him after her father's disgrace. Small, shamed, yet standing ramrod straight in their threadbare parlor, her voice trembling but clear. "You'll have your due, sir, but you'll not have our dignity today. Not today." That quiet defiance, born of utter desperation, resonated now. Clara forced her breath to steady, her gaze sweeping the perimeter. Watch. Just watch. Gideon reached Silas. He didn't kneel immediately. He scanned the surrounding snowfield, the Winchester tracking a slow, predatory arc satisfied no immediate ambush sprang. He holstered the Colt at his hip with one hand and roughly rolled the trapper onto his back with the other. Even from a window, Clara saw the dark, wet stain blooming across the front of Silas's heavy coat, stark against the snow he collapsed into. Gideon pressed fingers against Silas's neck, then leaned close, shouting something lost in the wind shriek. Silas's head lolled, but his lips moved weakly. Decision made. Gideon slung the Winchester over his shoulder, hooked his hands under Silas's armpits, and began dragging the dead weight backwards towards the cabin. It was a brutal, ungainly struggle through the deep, sucking snow. Clara unbolted the door, holding it open against the gale's push. Gideon hauled Silas across the threshold, the trapper's boots scraping frozen clumps onto the floorboards. Clara slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy bolt home. The relative silence inside was jarring, broken only by the storm's muffled fury and Silas's labored, wet breathing. Gideon dropped to his knees beside the trapper, his breath pluming in the suddenly colder air from the open door. His face was grim, etched through the effort and the cold. "Knife wound," he grunted, ripping open Silas's coat and woolen shirt beneath. "Hi, left side." Might have nicked a lung. The wound was ugly, a deep, ragged puncture still oozing dark blood. Silas groaned, his eyes fluttering open, filled with pain and terror. "Tate," he rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Found me after I warned you. Called me a traitor. Rourke, his foreman, did this." He coughed a harsh, tearing sound. "Gather him in, saloon livery. Every hard case owes him or fears him. Told him your gold hidden out here, army gold. Promised my share for burning you out at first light." His voice faded, his eyes rolling back. Gold. The lie was insidious. Perfect fuel for greed in a hardscrabble territory. Tate wasn't just leveraging his power. He was weaponizing desperation and avarice. The threat of a mob, whipped into a frenzy by promises of loot and the chance to eliminate the Iron Ghost, was infinitely more dangerous than a few hired hands. "Water," Gideon ordered, his voice clipped. He was already pressing a wad of cleanish linen from the pile near the basin against the wound. "And the whiskey. Need to clean this." Clara moved swiftly, her earlier fear momentarily overridden by the immediate, brutal reality before her. She brought the water pail and the half-empty bottle of cheap rye Gideon, kept for medicinal purposes. Kneeling beside him on the hard floor, she soaked another scrap of linen. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the sharp bite of whiskey filled the small space. Gideon worked with grim efficiency. cleaning the wound as best he could, his large hands surprisingly deft despite their calluses and the cold stiffness. Clara held the lantern closer, the light flickering over Silas's ashen face, Gideon's intense focus, the dark stains spreading on the floorboards. "My brother," Clara found herself saying, the word surprising her as much as Gideon, who glanced up briefly. The memory surfaced, sharp and painful, triggered by the violence, by the sense of being hunted. Thomas. He was younger. After the scandal broke, the boys in town, they tormented him, called him thief spawn, threw mud, stones. Her voice tightened. One day he fought back, punched a ringleader, son of the new bank manager. They ganged up on him, broke his arm. He never fought again, just folded it on himself, like a flower crushed before it bloomed. She dabbed at the blood on Silas's chest with a whiskey-soaked cloth, her hand trembling slightly. Mother wept that night, not just for his arm, for his spirit. She said, "They steal your light, child, when you let M make you small." Clara met Gideon's gaze, a fierce, protective ember glowing in her own. "Tate's trying to make us small. Scared. Hiding. He won't steal my light. Not again." Gideon held her gaze for a long moment. The firelight caught the deep lines around his eyes, the weariness, but also a new, fierce resolve mirroring hers. He gave a single, curt nod. It was acknowledgement, understanding, a silent pact forged in blood and shared defiance. He finished packing the wound as best he could, using more linen to bind it tightly. Silas moaned but remained unconscious. "He needs a real doctor," Gideon stated, rising stiffly. "Won't last the night otherwise. And we can't stay." He moved to the window, peering out into the relentless storm. Tate's mob, even if half believe the goal lie, they'll come. With torches, guns, liquid courage. He turned, his eyes scanning the small cabin, their fortress, now their potential pyre. "We need to move Silas. Find a place to hole up they won't expect. Buy time." "The O-line shack?" Clara suggested, recalling the brief, cold ride here, Gideon pointing out a dilapidated structure nearly swallowed by pines further up the ridge. "You said it was half fallen in and used for years." Gideon considered it, a flicker of approval in his eyes at her initiative. Possible. Higher ground. Better sight lines. But getting there in this. He gestured toward the howling darkness beyond the walls. "And Silas," he looked at the unconscious trapper, then at Clara, a silent question hanging. "Could she manage?" "We have to try," Clara said firmly. "We can rig a travois, use the mare." Gideon nodded, already moving toward the trunk near his cot. He pulled out a coil of stout rope and a worn canvas tarp. "Get the water skins filled. All of them. Pack any food that'll travel easy. Hardtack jerky, that sack of beans, and the medical supplies." He tossed her a worn leather satchel. "Wrap up warm. It's a brutal trek." They worked with urgent, silent efficiency, a well-oiled machine born of necessity. Clara filled the water skins of the barrel outside, the cold stealing her breath, her eyes constantly scanning the swirling gloom for movement. Inside, Gideon fashioned a crude travois from the tarp in 2 long, straight pine branches he'd stored near the woodpile. He checked the Winchester and Colt meticulously, loading them to capacity, stuffing extra cartridges into his coat pockets. He paused by the mantel, his hand hovering over the brass pocket watch. For a heartbeat, his mask slipped, revealing the raw anguish beneath. Jenkins's face, the harmonica, the unfulfilled promise to a grieving mother. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he took a small, folded piece of paper tucked behind it. A brittle, yellowed letter Clara hadn't noticed before. He stared at it, his jaw clenched, then shoved it deep into an inner pocket of his coat, close to his heart. Another burden shouldered. Clara pretended not to notice the private moment. She packed the satchel, water, hardtack, salt jerky, the beans, the remaining whiskey, the bandages and salve. She pulled on every layer she had, then Gideon's massive buffalo coat again, feeling like a child playing dress-up but grateful for its weight. Gideon bundled Silas in blankets, securing him to the travois with the rope. The trapper groaned but didn't wake. Just as Gideon was about to unbolt the door to fetch the mare from the lean-to, Clara, double-checking the window hides fastenings, froze. A flicker of movement, low to the ground near the water barrel. Not human, an animal, but it was too purposeful. She squinted, wiping condensation from the hide. There, partially obscured by blowing snow, was a small, dark shape, a burlap sack, its top gaping open. It hadn't been there when she'd filled the water skins minutes ago. "Gideon," she whispered urgently. He was instantly beside her, following her pointing finger. His expression darkened. "Sabotage," he hissed. He unbolted the door, stepping out just far enough to snatch the sack. Pulling inside, he appended it onto the floor. Not grain or supplies. Dirt, frozen gritty earth mixed with sharp, glistening shards. Glass, broken bottle glass. "The mare!" Gideon breathed, a fresh wave of cold dread washing over Clara that had nothing to do with the storm. He flung the door open wider this time, plunging out towards the lean-to. Clara followed, the poker raised uselessly against the gale. The bay mare was agitated, stamping her feet, her breath pluming in ragged bursts. Gideon ran his hands swiftly down her legs. He stopped at her left foreleg, just above the hoof. Even in the dim light bleeding from the cabin, Clara saw the dark, wet stain matting the hair. Gideon probed gently, and the mare flinched violently, snorting in pain. He held up his hand. Clenched in his gloved fingers were several vicious slivers of broken glass, slick with blood. "They crippled her," Gideon said, his voice flat with suppressed rage. He looked toward the tree line, his face a mask of stone in the storm's gloom. "Sometime while we were busy with Silas, slipped up, cut the bag, scattered the glass where she'd step. It was calculated cruelty, not just to strand them, but to inflict suffering, to remove their means of escape or defense. Tate wasn't just coming. He was systematically dismantling their options. The implications crashed down. No horse. Silas critically wounded and unable to walk. A travois journey through a blizzard to a distant shack was now impossible. They were trapped, truly trapped. The cabin, their refuge, was rapidly becoming a death trap as dawn and Tate's mob approached. Gideon carefully picked the remaining glass from the mare's tender frog, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the fury radiating from him. He packed snow around the cut to numb it and stem the bleeding, then led the limping animal back into the relative shelter of the lean-to. Speaking low, calming words lost to the wind, he returned to the cabin. His shoulders slumped not in defeat, but under the crushing weight of their predicament. He bolted the door, leaning his forehead against the cold oak for a moment. Clara stood amidst the scattered glass and dirt, the packed satchel at her feet, the unconscious Silas on the travois. The fire crackled, its warmth suddenly mocking. The wind screamed like a banshee chorus heralding doom. All their preparations, their fragile hope of escape, shattered like the glass under the mare's hoof. Gideon turned from the door. His face was bleak, but his pale eyes burned with a cold, desperate fire. "Barricade the windows," he said, his voice rough. "Move the table. Anything heavy. We make our stand here." He picked up the Winchester, the action final. "They want to fight? They'll get one." Clara nodded, pushing down the swell of terror. She looked at Silas, at the blood-stained floor, at Gideon loading the rifle with grim determination. Her mother's words echoed, "They steal your light when you let M make you small." Tate had tried to make her small in the saloon. He was trying to crush them now. She wouldn't be small. She hefted the heavy oak table, dragging it towards the door with a scrape that echoed in the tense silence. They would fight, together. They worked frantically, piling firewood, the trunk, anything with weight against the door and the windows, leaving only narrow slits for the rifle barrels. The wind seemed to howl louder, a constant reminder of the enemy outside and the time slipping away. Gideon positioned himself at the window slit, overlooking the clearing and the trail, the Winchester ready. Clara took the other window. Near the door, the poker her only weapon, her eyes straining into the swirling white chaos beyond the small circle of firelight bleeding to the hides. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity of listening, waiting, the storm a monstrous shroud hiding their fate. Silas's breathing grew shallower, more ragged. The fire burned lower. The cold crept back in, finger by icy finger. Clara's limbs ached with tension and cold. Gideon hadn't moved from his post, a statue carved from vigilance and regret. Then, as the first faint, gray hint of false dawn began to dilute the absolute blackness beyond the window slit, Gideon stiffened. He held up a clenched fist. Silence. Clara froze, her breath catching. She peered out. At first, she saw nothing but the relentless snow. Then movement. Not close. Far down the trail, near the tree line where it opened onto the wider approach to the cabin. Flickering points of light. Dozens of them. Tiny, bobbing flames in the swirling gloom, like malevolent fireflies. Torches. A long, low sound drifted on the wind, faint but unmistakable. The distant, hungry baying of hounds. Tate's mob was on the move. The baying hounds were a savage counterpoint to the wind's mournful dirge. Torchlight, like malevolent, bloodshot eyes, pierced the swirling pre-dawn gloom, revealing the advancing mob, a ragged, shifting mass of 30 men or more, their faces hardened by frontier life and twisted by greed and liquor. Dawn bled a thin, gray light onto the snow-covered clearing, illuminating the scale of their peril. Amos Tate rode at the forefront, astride a powerful chestnut gelding, swayed in a bearskin coat, his face a mask of triumphant malice. Beside him, mounted and sneering, was Rourke, the foreman whose knife had found Silas and whose spur marked their porch. Inside the barricaded cabin, the air hung thick with the coppery tang of Silas's blood, the ghost of gunpowder, and the suffocating dread of finality. The fire was embers, offering scant warmth, less light. Gideon Holt stood like a statue carved from vigilance at the narrow window slit, facing the clearing, the Winchester resting steady on the sill. His profile was granite, the bandage on his temple stark against his weathered skin. Clara Hayes pressed herself against the logs beside the other slit. Near the door, the cold iron poker slick in her sweating grip. The borrowed buffalo coat felt like a leaden shroud. She saw the torches reflected in the eyes of the men, drifters, desperate miners, Tate's loyal thugs, a hydra of ignorance and avarice. Hold! Tate's voice boomed, amplified by the tense stillness as the mob halted just beyond reliable rifle range. Iron Ghost, still hiding behind logs? Hand over to Hayes woman, and any army gold you're hoarding, and maybe we let you crawl out of that grave you dug for yourself. Raucous, ugly laughter rippled through the ranks. Clara felt the old shame, the saloon's crushing humiliation, rise like bile. Then her mother's voice, frail but unbroken amid society's scorn, echoed, "They steal your light, child, when you let M make you small." Fury ignited, cold and pure, burning away the fear. She would not be small. Not now. Not ever again. Gideon didn't raise his voice. It cut through the wind with the clarity of a struck bell, a commander addressing his troops, even if they were his enemies. There's no gold, Tate, just the lie you fed these men to turn them into your rabid dogs. Silas Rourke lies gut-shot inside because he dared warn me of your treachery. That's the payment for your lies. Blood. His blood. A ripple of unease passed through the mob. Men shifted, exchanged glances. The promise of riches was potent, but the stark image of a bleeding man inside the cabin, Gideon's unwavering conviction, sowed seeds of doubt. Tate's ruddy face darkened. "Liar," he spat, venom dripping from the word. "Yellow-bellied coward, got good men killed. Think these folks care about your excuses? They want what you stole. Open up, or we burn the whore and the ghost together." The crude insult struck Clara like a physical blow, but it also crystallized her resolve. Before Gideon could counter, she stepped closer to her window slit, her voice rising clear and strong, cutting through the mob's restless murmur. "My name is Clara Hayes," she declared, the wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face like battle pennants. "I came to Bear Ridge trusting Amos Tate's written promise. He lied. It was a wager, $10 for the town's cruelest joke." She thrust an accusing finger towards a mounted rancher. "He shamed me before them all. Gideon Holt offered me shelter when no soul dared cross Amos Tate. That's the only crime here. Tate's greed, his fear of a man who stands alone. He poisons Bear Ridge with lies and violence. Look at Silas. Look at the innocent horse he crippled with glass. Is this your leader? A man who stabs allies and maims beasts." Silence descended, profound and heavy. Torch flames guttered wildly. Men stared at Tate, then at the cabin, then at each other. The picture Clara painted, of a woman fighting back with truth, of a wounded man and a crippled animal, clashed violently with Tate's narrative of stolen gold and righteous vengeance. Gideon saw the fissure, the moment of hesitation. It was the opening. He slammed his fist against the log wall beside the window, the impact echoing like a gunshot. "Jenkins," he roared, the name cracking the frozen air. Heads snapped towards him. Sergeant Micah Jenkins, Fort Mercer, Arizona Territory. 5 years gone. I gave the order that sent him and 5 others into an Apache trap. My mistake. My burden. I carry it." He paused, the raw admission hanging thick. "But I didn't hide behind lies. I didn't turn men into mobs for land. I live with it. Amos Tate lives by twisting the truth and breaking anyone who sees him for what he is. Is that the man you follow? Or are you men?" The confession, raw and unexpected, coupled with Clara's fierce defense, shattered the mob's fragile cohesion. The invocation of a fallen soldier, the stark admission of fault. It resonated with men who understood loss in the harsh ledger of frontier life. Shame flickered on weathered faces. Horses stamped nervously. Men at the back began to edge away. Tate saw his control crumbling. Fury twisted his features. "Enough! Burn him! Burn the liars out! Now!" He gestured wildly. Torches. To the doors. Windows. Rourke and a knot of hard-faced loyalists spurred forward, brandishing their flaming brands. "Smoke him out," Rourke bellowed, kicking his horse toward the cabin porch. "Clara, the pitch." Gideon hissed, his voice tight. He raised the Winchester, not aiming at the men, but high into the air above the charging riders. Crack, crack, crack. 3 sharp reports shattered the tension, echoing like thunderclaps in confined clearing. Simultaneously, Clara moved. She seized a heavy tin coffee pot, sloshing with cold dregs from the hearth. Using the thick buffalo hide sleeve as protection, she wrenched the lid off the small tin of pine pitch. Scooping a thick, pungent glob onto the end of her iron poker, she thrust the coated tip deep into the fire's dying embers. Whoosh! The pitch ignited instantly, transforming the poker into a roaring, spitting brand. Acrid smoke filled the cabin. Ignoring the heat singeing the hide sleeve, Clara lunged her window slit, just as Rourke and 2 others reached the porch steps. She thrust the blazing weapon out into the gloom. "Back!" she screamed, her voice raw with defiance and smoke. She swung the flaming brand in a wide, furious arc. The horses, already unnerved by the gunfire, reared violently at the sudden, hissing inferno. Rourke's mount screamed, twisting sideways and throwing him heavily into a deep snowdrift beside the steps. One rider was flung backwards, his torch spinning harmlessly into the snow where it died with a hiss. The 3rd man fought his panicked horse, barely staying mounted as it scrambled away. The unexpected, fiery counterattack from the woman they'd scorned, the sight of their foreman floundering, the crack of Gideon's defiant shots. It broke the mob. Panic erupted. "Fall back. It's an ambush." Tate lied. He used us. Get Silas. Fetch Doc Henderson. The Hydra disintegrated. Men wheeled their horses, some fleeing outright, others milling in confusion. The fight extinguished. The torchlight scattered and receded like dying stars into the pines. Only Amos Tate remained, frozen on his gelding, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He saw Rourke floundering, his men scattering. He saw Clara Hayes, face smudged, holding the smoking poker like a vengeful spirit. He saw Gideon Holt, the Winchester now lowered and aimed unwaveringly at his chest, those pale eyes colder than the Wyoming winter. This ain't finished, Holt. Tate spat, his voice shrill. You hear? That land is mine. That woman is mine. You're a dead man. Gideon's voice cut through the wind, quiet, lethal. Ride out, Tate. Now, while you still draw breath. Next time, I am center mass. Hatred burned in Tate's eyes. His hand twitched near his pistol. For a heartbeat, violence seemed inevitable. Then, the utter collapse of his scheme, his isolation, and the unwavering rifle barrel registered. With a final, venomous glare that promised future reckoning, he savagely yanked the reins, spurring his horse around. He rode hard after the remnants of his shattered mob, leaving Rourke to scramble for his own spooked horse. The baying of the hounds faded, swallowed by the wind and distance. Silence rushed in profound and immense. Only the wind's sigh and Silas's ragged breathing remained. Clara slowly withdrew the poker, the pitch consumed, the iron tip glowing dull red. It clattered from her numb fingers. She leaned back against the cold logs, trembling violently as the adrenaline ebbed, the sheer weight of survival crashing over her. Gideon lowered the Winchester, the tension draining from his frame, leaving him looking hollowed out, ancient. He turned from the window, his gaze finding Clara. In the gray dawn light filtering through the slits, their eyes locked. Relief, disbelief, exhaustion, and profound, unspoken understanding flowed between them. They had faced annihilation back to back and weathered the storm. He moved first, crossing the small space in 2 strides. He didn't embrace her, but stopped close, his hand reaching out, hovering for a heartbeat before settling gently on her shoulder. The touch, simple and grounding, spoke volumes. You were, he swallowed, the words thick. Magnificent, Clara Hayes. A sob caught in Clara's throat, part release, part overwhelming relief. She covered his hand with hers, her fingers cold but steady. We did it, Gideon. We stood. He nodded, a flicker of something resembling peace touching the corners of his weary eyes. We stood together. Summer, 1889. Sunlight, warm and generous, streamed to the large front window of Hayes and Holt Dry Goods on Bear Ridge's bustling Main Street. The memory of snow and siege felt like a half-remembered dream. Inside, bolts of vibrant gingham and sturdy canvas-lined shelves. Glass jars held buttons, threads, and packets of seeds. Clara Hayes Holt, her dark hair neatly pinned, measured calico for young Maisie Henderson with steady hands and a warm smile. Confidence, hard-won, had replaced a tremor of shame. That'll make a fine dress for the harvest dance, Maisie, Clara said, deftly folding the fabric. Her voice carried the quiet assurance of belonging. Pa, says Gideon fixed our plow blade better and new. Maisie chirped, clutching her parcel. Said he's a wonder with metal. Clara's smile deepened. He has a knack for mending things. She watched Maisie skip out into the sunshine. Bear Ridge hadn't forgotten the winter of '87. Silas Rourke, recovered slowly but surely, had testified vividly against Tate. Disgraced, facing charges of incitement and assault, Amos Tate had sold his diminished holdings for a pittance and vanished into the territories, a bitter ghost haunting rumors elsewhere. The land Gideon held, the land Tate had coveted with such violence, remained theirs. But it was more than land they held now. Later, Clara closed the shop. She walked the familiar path out of town, the summer air thick with the scent of sagebrush and wildflowers. Prairie grasses swayed, dotted with purple lupin and yellow balsam root. She found him not at the cabin, nor at the solid, rebuilt line shack higher on the ridge, but on a gentle rise just beyond their home. Gideon stood beside a simple split-rail fence encircling a small, well-tended patch of earth. Not a grave, but a sanctuary. A smooth, river-washed stone stood upright, engraved with a single name, Micah Jenkins. Beside it, nestled amongst hardy wildflowers that thrive in the Wyoming summer, lay a brass pocket watch. Its glass face caught the afternoon sun. The deep scratches on its casing softened by time and weather, no longer a shackle but a testament. Jenkins's harmonica, carefully straightened as much as possible, had been sent back to Kansas years prior with a long, honest letter. The watch remained, a quiet guardian, a promise kept in spirit. He heard her soft footfall on the grass and turned. His face, still lean but no longer etched with perpetual bleakness, broke into a smile that reached his pale eyes. He wore work-stained trousers and a faded blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, embodying a peace hard-earned. "Early closing?" he asked, his voice still gravelly but warm. "Thought I'd see how the Remembrance Garden fares," Clara replied, joining with the fence. Delicate blue flax and scarlet paintbrush bloomed around the stone and watch, and pay respect to Jenkins. Gideon nodded, looking at the marker. "Quiet out here. Good quiet." He reached out, his calloused hand finding hers. Their fingers intertwined, a familiar, anchoring touch forged in desperation and nurtured in calm. It spoke of a bond deeper than vows, a sanctuary built from shared scars and unwavering trust. They stood together in the golden light, looking out over the land, their cabin, smoke curling lazily from its chimney, the prairie stretching vast and generous towards a hazy blue mountains. The wind rustled the tall grasses, a gentle melody compared to the winter's scream. The ghosts of public shame, of crushing guilt, of a rancher's predatory shadow, still drifted at the edges of memory, but they held no dominion here. They had faced a howling darkness, stood firm against the tide of malice, and emerged, scarred but unbroken. Together, they watched the sun begin its descent, painting the vast sky in streaks of rose and molten gold, a silent benediction for the life they had built. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder. Two solitary stars, once adrift in the cold void, had found their fixed place in the same, enduring constellation, bathed in the quiet, triumphant light of a frontier dusk. The vast open land, once a symbol of Gideon's exile, now embraced them, an endless horizon filled with the quiet, resilient promise of tomorrow.